The night Roger Bellamy died, the sea was calm, but in every pair of eyes a storm was raging. Someone was lying, someone was hiding the truth, and someone was just waiting for the truth to sink to the bottom of the ocean, never to be found again. But the truth never stays buried. Every step, every silent glance, and every unsteady breath pointed toward a secret that only one person could see. It was a warm, luminous morning, the kind that made St. Mary Me feel untouched by time, as though history had paused within its narrow lanes and quiet meadows. Miss Jane Merrill sat at her small kitchen table, sipping tea from her favorite, slightly chipped mug, savoring the soft, warm scone she had baked herself. There was something soothing about kneading dough, an old habit that had always brought her peace. Outside, the world was wrapped in stillness, save for the faint hum of village chatter drifting through the open window. The postman was giving his opinion on the weather, Mrs. Patterson was lamenting the state of her roses, and the villagers exchanged words as if gossip and news were one and the same. But then the delicate peace of the morning was broken by a soft knock at the door. Miss Marple set her cup down, rising slowly as her aging bones demanded, and opened the door to find a young maid, her face flushed from the morning heat. "A letter for you, Miss Marple. From Miss Adelaide Wright, I believe." The name on the envelope, written in an elegant hand, made Miss Marple pause. Adelaide Wright, now that was a name buried deep in the past. Once a fixture in St. Mary Me, Adelaide had vanished from village life for years, and now she was back. But why? Miss Marple opened the letter, her sharp eyes scanning a seaside picnic, a simple gathering, and then a surprise. The corners of Miss Marple's lips curled ever so slightly. Adelaide Wright had always possessed a taste for theatrics, for turning the ordinary into something grand. If this were merely a casual picnic, she wouldn't have issued an invitation in such a way. No, something else was at play here. The coastal cove was as she remembered it, wild, remote, a place where people came to escape their troubles, or perhaps find them. The air was warm, the breeze gentle yet carrying an unspoken tension. Adelaide Wright stood at the center of the gathering, her posture unnaturally straight, as though she were preparing for a performance. Around her, a small assembly of guests, 2 women, a man, a young couple, engaged in forced pleasantries, their smiles polite but thinly veiling unease. Their glances darted, some fleeting, some sharp, all betraying the unspoken currents beneath the surface. "How wonderful of you to join us." Adelaide's voice was bright, too bright. Then came the introductions. Gerald Harper, broad-shouldered, well-dressed, and reeking of wealth acquired through means he wasn't eager to discuss. "And this is Lorna Wells," Adelaide said with a smirk that Miss Marple didn't quite like. The young woman's posture was too rigid, her hands clasped too tightly. There was something there, something just beneath the surface, something that made Miss Marple's instincts sharpen. The picnic unfolded with the usual formalities. Tea was poured, sandwiches passed around, but the conversation was brittle, punctuated by awkward silences. There was a tension in the air, not quite visible, but unmistakably present. Miss Marple sensed it like a scent carried on the wind, something unspoken, something waiting, and then it happened. A scream, not loud, not piercing, but the kind of scream that made the world stop, and just like that, everything changed. The afternoon sun bathed the quiet village of St. Mary Me in a golden light, but there was something uneasy in the air, something that did not belong to the peaceful hum of everyday life. Miss Eleanor Hargrove sat at her wooden kitchen table, her fingers wrapped around a lukewarm cup of tea, her sharp eyes flicking toward the lace-curtained window. Outside, the murmur of voices carried on the breeze, anxious hushed. The villagers whispered like wind through the trees, their words curling around rumors that had spread like wildfire. Something had happened, something sinister, and in a place like St. Mary Me, where secrets clung to the cobblestone streets like morning mist, it was never just idle gossip. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Setting her cup down with quiet precision, she moved to answer it, her every step deliberate. The face that met her on the other side was that of young Martha Kane, breathless, her cheeks flushed with urgency. "Miss Hargrove," she gasped, "there's been a death." The words, though expected, still sent a ripple through Eleanor's mind. At the picnic, Martha continued, her voice dropping to a whisper, "Mr. Winslow collapsed, right there on the sand." Eleanor's sharp gaze lingered on the girl's face, searching for the detail that hadn't been spoken aloud. "Collapsed," she echoed, her voice smooth, unwavering. "Dead before the doctor arrived," Martha confirmed, eyes darting about as though she feared someone might overhear. "They say it was his heart, but..." The pause was weighted. Eleanor let it sit in the space between them, waiting for the truth to surface. "But you don't believe it," she finished for the girl, a knowing glint in her eyes. Martha swallowed hard and shook her head. "Neither do I," Eleanor murmured, already reaching for her coat. By the time she reached the coastal cove, the gathering had thinned, the body had been taken away, but the echoes of the event still clung to the air. Adelaide Vernon stood at the center of it all, ever the poised hostess, despite the tragedy that had unfolded under her watch. Around her, the guests, now suspects, whether they realized it or not, were scattered, some speaking in hushed tones, others staring out at the sea, as if the waves might wash away whatever it was they wished to forget. Eleanor's gaze drifted over them, taking in the small details, a clenched jaw, a nervous fidget, a glance held too long. These were not the reactions of people mourning a natural death. These were the telltale signs of those entangled in something much darker. "Eleanor, you've come," Adelaide greeted, her voice smooth, carefully measured. "A terrible thing, isn't it? Terrible thing, isn't it?" "Terrible," Eleanor agreed, stepping forward. "Though terribly timed as well, wouldn't you say?" Adelaide's smile did not falter, but something flickered in her eyes. A brief hesitation, a breath held too long. "Timing is a peculiar thing," she said, tilting her head. "Sometimes fate is simply cruel." Eleanor said nothing. Instead she let the silence speak for her, let the weight of it settle like fog over the sand, because she knew, as surely as she knew anything, that fate had nothing to do with what had happened here today. And before long the truth, however deeply buried, would find its way to the surface. It always did. The village of Ravenshade had always thrived on its secrets, hidden behind ivy-covered walls and the whisper of the wind through ancient oaks. Miss Evelyn Graves sat by the bay window of her modest yet well-kept cottage, her fingers poised over a delicate embroidery hoop, but her sharp blue eyes were fixed on the street below. The late afternoon sun cast elongated shadows as the villagers moved with an unusual urgency. Furtive glances exchanged, hurried steps murmured, conversations cut short as soon as someone new approached. Something had unsettled them. And in Ravenshade, an unsettled village meant one thing: a secret was on the verge of being exposed. A knock at her door pulled her from her musings. She rose gracefully, smoothing out the creases in her skirt before answering. Mrs. Hawthorne stood there, breathless, her usual composure fraying at the edges. "Evelyn," she said in a hushed tone, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "You won't believe it. Mr. Dunridge is dead." Miss Graves blinked once, absorbing the news without betraying a hint of emotion. "Dead?" she repeated, setting down her embroidery. "How?" Mrs. Hawthorne leaned in, lowering her voice further. "Collapsed at the lake, right in front of everyone. They say his heart gave out, but..." She hesitated, glancing around as if the walls might hear. "But you think otherwise?" "I know otherwise," the woman whispered, gripping her handbag with white-knuckled fingers. "I was standing near him when it happened. He was fine one moment, then clutching his chest the next. But it wasn't the look of pain on his face, Evelyn. It was the look of realization. As if he knew." A shiver of understanding ran down Miss Graves' spine. Knew what? That someone had done this to him. The words hung heavy between them. Evelyn did not waste time with reassurances. She simply reached for her coat. By the time she arrived at the lake, the crowd had thinned, but the ripples of the event lingered. The guests of the ill-fated gathering milled about, some whispering in corners, others adopting an air of practiced detachment. Adelaide Fairchild, the orchestrator of the lakeside picnic, stood at the center of it all, her deep crimson dress, a stark contrast against the pale light of the fading day. "Evelyn," she greeted, her voice rich and honeyed. "How unexpected." "Not as unexpected as today's turn of events," Miss Graves replied, watching Adelaide's expression for the telltale flicker of something unspoken. The other guests were a motley mix, some long-time villagers, others new arrivals still weaving themselves into the fabric of Ravenshade's unspoken rules. There was Nathaniel Crowley, the brooding landowner whose finances had seen better days. Vivian Holloway, the young widow with too much charm and too few inhibitions. And of course there was Mr. Hawthorne, whose polite smiles never quite reached his calculating eyes. And then there was Roger Wakefield. He arrived late, as always. Tall, impeccably dressed, his presence was not just noticed, it demanded attention. He did not rush to offer condolences, nor did he inquire after the details of Dunridge's demise. Instead he simply observed. "Mr. Wakefield," Evelyn greeted, her voice light but edged with steel. "An interesting day for a picnic, wouldn't you say?" "Indeed," he replied smoothly, his gaze steady. "A shame about Mr. Dunridge." "A shame certainly," she murmured, watching his face carefully. "Especially considering his sudden interest in the old Ashford estate." A muscle in Wakefield's jaw tensed. Barely noticeable, but enough. Miss Graves filed that reaction away with all the others. Because if there was one thing she knew about Ravenshade, it was that death was never just death. It was a message, and messages always came with hidden hands behind them. The trick was knowing where to look. The village of Blackthorn Hollow had always carried an air of foreboding, its stone cottages nestled beneath the watchful gaze of towering elms, the scent of damp earth lingering long after the rain. It was the kind of place where the past refused to be buried, where whispers clung to the air like mist rolling in from the moors. And tonight, those whispers had taken a darker turn. Miss Eleanor Graves sat outside the post office, her delicate fingers wrapped around a cup of cooling tea, her sharp eyes scanning the cobbled streets. Something had shifted, conversations hushed when she approached, nervous glances flickered between villagers, and footsteps quickened as if eager to escape unseen forces. She had spent years deciphering the language of silence, and today it spoke of unease. The weight of an unspoken truth hung over Blackthorn Hollow like a storm cloud on the verge of breaking. The news arrived in the form of Mrs. Fletcher, the town's most eager harbinger of misfortune. The woman's lips were pressed into a thin line of urgency as she leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "Miss Graves," she murmured, eyes darting around to ensure no one was listening. "A tragedy at the old Briarwick estate. Mr. Caldwell, dead in his study. Poison, they say." A chill settled over Eleanor that had nothing to do with the evening breeze. "Poison," she repeated, her voice measured and devoid of surprise. "Not an accident then?" Mrs. Fletcher scoffed, shaking her head. "Hardly. You know what they say about Briarwick. Trouble follows it like a shadow." Eleanor knew more than most about the whispers that clung to the estate. It was an old house, standing defiantly against the ravages of time, its windows hollow and watchful. Its previous owner, Lord Dunmore, had vanished years ago, leaving only questions behind. Caldwell had acquired the property only recently, a man of ambition, but not the kind that endeared him to the locals. "And who discovered him?" Eleanor inquired. "The housekeeper. Poor woman was half mad with fright." "And the police?" "Muddling about as usual," Mrs. Fletcher huffed. "But there's talk." She hesitated. lowering her voice further. "They say Roger Linton was seen near the estate that night. You know the type. Too smooth, too polite, and far too interested in Caldwell's affairs." Eleanor did know the type. She had seen them come and go from Blackthorn Hollow, men who believed they could shape the village to their will, carve fortunes from the land, and people alike, and every time the village had resisted in ways both quiet and brutal. That evening, she attended the gathering at the Thornwood Inn, where oil lamps cast long shadows against the wooden beams, and the air was thick with unspoken truths. The villagers sat in clusters, their conversations punctuated by uneasy glances, voices dipping whenever Caldwell's name was mentioned, and in the center of it all stood Roger Linton, his presence as carefully orchestrated as the rest of his life. He was a man who carried himself with practiced ease, dressed in a way that suggested wealth without ostentation. His smile was charming, but his eyes were watchful, calculating. "Miss Graves," he greeted, lifting his glass in a silent toast. "A pleasure as always." Eleanor met his gaze without hesitation. "The pleasure is mine, Mr. Linton, though I suspect our conversation tonight will be less than pleasant." His smile flickered, just for a moment, a barely perceptible crack in the polished veneer. "I hear you've taken an interest in Briarwick," she continued. "An unfortunate tragedy," Linton said smoothly, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Caldwell was a man with grand ideas. It's a shame, really." "Indeed," Eleanor murmured, watching him carefully. "And yet you were seen near the estate the night of his death." A single beat of silence, barely noticeable, but she caught it. "Rumors," Linton said lightly, though his grip on his glass tightened. "A man is allowed to take a walk, is he not?" "Certainly," Eleanor allowed, "though I do wonder why one would choose to stroll so close to a house where a man was dying." Another pause, longer this time, then a chuckle, deliberate but strained. "Miss Graves, you wound me. Surely you don't believe I had anything to do with it?" Eleanor's lips curled into the ghost of a smile. "That remains to be seen." The night pressed on, the conversation shifting around them, but Eleanor knew one thing for certain: death in Blackthorn Hollow was never random. She watched as Linton moved through the room, all ease and charm, but there was something beneath it, something frayed. He had expected Caldwell's death to be the end of the matter. He had not accounted for her. The whispers would grow louder in the coming days. The truth, as it always did, would claw its way to the surface, and if Roger Linton had something to hide, Eleanor Graves would find it. Blackwood Cove had always carried an air of quiet intrigue, a place where the sea whispered secrets to those who dared to listen. The village was old, its foundations built on legacies of wealth, power, and betrayal. Tonight, beneath the low-hanging mist, that history stirred once more. Miss Eleanor Graves sat stiffly in the back of the carriage, her gloved fingers drumming lightly against her lap as the driver, a wiry man with sharp, knowing eyes, spoke in a hushed voice. "A bit of a spot of bother, ma'am," he muttered, his grin tight with something unreadable. "Word is the good captain's run out of coin, though he's too proud to admit it. His estate's bleeding him dry, but he won't let go of it. Men like him, they'd sooner drown than sell their birthright." Eleanor tilted her head, considering. Pride can be an expensive indulgence, the driver chuckled darkly, and desperation makes strange bedfellows. "I'd wager Captain Harrow has already made some arrangements, the kind a man might not survive." She let that thought settle, the pieces already beginning to form in her mind. Captain Harrow was a man of reputation, once commanding the tides themselves, but now, he was simply a relic, bound to an estate he couldn't afford, and a past he refused to let go. Desperation could make a man dangerous, and in a place like Blackwood Cove, danger never lingered far from ambition. "And Peter Lloyd?" she asked, voice light but probing. The driver's smirk faded. "A slippery one, that Lloyd. Runs the Driftwood Inn, though barely. That place has seen better days, and so has he. But he's got his sights on more than just his failing business. He watches the captain closely, and if you ask me, he's just waiting for the right moment to strike." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. Men like Lloyd survived by patience, by positioning themselves at the right place, at the right time, often just before a fall. And then there was Bellamy, a name that carried weight, spoken with hushed tones and careful glances, a businessman whose fortunes never dwindled, whose fingers reached into every transaction, every whispered deal, every opportunity that came at another man's ruin. He moved like the tide, relentless, inevitable. "Bellamy," she murmured, "and what does he want?" The driver's hands tightened on the reins. "The estate, of course, and anything that comes with it." The carriage jolted as they reached the cove, the salty air thick with the tang of brine, and something heavier, something unspoken. Eleanor stepped out, smoothing the folds of her coat as her eyes swept the gathering before her. A picnic, in name only, beneath the facade of clinking teacups and carefully curated pleasantries. Tension curled like the mist over the water. Captain Harrow stood at the center, his presence as commanding as ever, but his coat hung looser on his frame, and there was something in his eyes, something that spoke of battles fought beyond the sea, struggles unseen. Nearby, Peter Lloyd moved with the restless energy of a man watching a house of cards teetering, waiting to see which way it would fall, and standing apart, ever the observer, Roger Bellamy checked his pocket watch. The movement precise, deliberate. Time, after all, was a currency he never wasted. "If we're quite finished," Bellamy said, his voice cutting through the idle chatter like a blade, "perhaps we can turn to the matter at hand." Captain Harrow's jaw tensed. "Business can wait." Bellamy's lips twitched. "Not quite a smile. Time doesn't wait, Captain. And neither do I." Eleanor watched the exchange carefully, her mind already working through the threads of this tangled web. Pride, desperation, and opportunity, each man standing at the precipice of something. And when the first move was made, when the inevitable unraveling began, she would be there to see the truth laid bare. The seaside air carried the crisp scent of salt, and something more elusive, something hidden beneath the lapping waves and the quiet tension threading through the gathering. Eleanor Graves stepped onto the sand, the whisper of silk against her gloves as she adjusted her shawl. The picnic had all the hallmarks of a well-orchestrated affair. Crisp linen blankets laid with precision, delicate sandwiches, arranged with excessive care, and the ever-present hum of conversation that carried just enough forced ease to make it clear. This was no ordinary gathering. Secrets hung in the air as thick as the sea mist rolling in. Roger Bellamy stood at the edge of the group, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. He was a man who never wasted time, and the polite chatter around him did not amuse him. His sharp gaze met Captain Harrow's, the silence between them heavy with unspoken history. "Moments of leisure," Harrow said lightly, pouring himself a drink with a steady hand, "are best enjoyed when one allows themselves the pleasure." Bellamy's response was cold, precise. "Enjoyment is a luxury for those with time to waste. I do not." Eleanor's gaze flickered between them. The exchange was simple, polite on the surface, but the tension beneath it was unmistakable. These men had crossed paths before, and not on friendly terms. The air between them crackled, and in that charged silence, something unspoken lurked, something neither was willing to put into words just yet. From the other side of the gathering, Adelaide Wayworth fluttered about with nervous energy, her hands fussing over the arrangement of a tea set that had already been arranged twice. She was smiling, of course, but her eyes flicked toward Bellamy, and in that fleeting glance, Eleanor saw it, fear, hesitation. It was small, just a flicker, but she had seen enough carefully concealed emotions in her lifetime to recognize the shape of anxiety when it surfaced. Adelaide turned to Eleanor, with the air of someone looking for reassurance. "Quite the gathering, isn't it?" she said with a forced laugh. "I do hope everything goes well." Eleanor smiled, but her words carried a quiet weight. Everything goes well, until it doesn't. A gust of wind stirred the fabric of the picnic awnings, rattling the delicate china stacked on the tables. Eleanor let her gaze sweep over the assembled guests. They were playing their roles well, casual chatter, laughter that rang just a touch too sharp, glances exchanged that meant more than they should. Each of them had come with a reason, and none of those reasons had anything to do with an afternoon by the sea. Then, as if summoned by the very air of tension, Caroline Dupré arrived. She stepped from her car with effortless grace, the kind of poise that suggested she had long mastered the art of concealing intent beneath charm. The waves behind her shimmered like molten silver under the sun, but she was colder than the sea breeze, her gaze sweeping over the gathering before settling on Bellamy. Her dress clung to her form in a way that was deliberate but not obvious, a calculated balance of allure and control. When she moved to stand beside him, the tension in the air shifted. Bellamy she greeted, voice smooth, measured. His response was a mere nod, brief but precise. Miss Dupré, her lips curled in something that was not quite a smile, charming as ever. Eleanor watched them carefully. Caroline was playing a part, but there was something beneath the surface, something that even she struggled to keep buried. A flicker of hesitation in her stance, the way she measured her words. She was here for a purpose, and it had little to do with Bellamy himself. Meanwhile, Peter Lloyd hovered at the edge of the picnic, his movements restless, eyes darting between the guests as if expecting something, or someone to appear. He was a man accustomed to being on the outside, watching for the moment to strike. Eleanor had seen his kind before. As the picnic unfolded, it became clear this was no simple afternoon gathering. It was a battlefield, one where words replaced weapons and glances carried the weight of hidden intentions. The storm had already begun, invisible but inevitable, lurking beneath the polished smiles and the idle conversation. Eleanor settled herself near the edge of the group, hands folded in her lap, waiting. She had no need to hurry. The truth would rise to the surface soon enough, because in a place like Blackwood Cove, no secret ever stayed buried for long. A gentle wave crashed against the shore, the salty breeze carrying a whisper of unease beneath the golden sunlight. Everything appeared serene on the surface. But beneath the warmth of the afternoon something else simmered, something that twisted every smile into a mask, and every glance into a silent conversation unspoken. This gathering, this so-called picnic, was not just a picnic, it was something far deeper, something on the verge of unraveling. Rosalind Hargrove, as always, was the center of attention. Her laughter rang louder than the rest, her gestures laced with an almost forced cheerfulness. But her fingers, absent-mindedly twisting the edge of her silk scarf, betrayed a nervous energy she couldn't quite hide. She cast a fleeting glance at Edmund Graves, who watched the scene from behind his spectacles, his expression unreadable. He was enjoying this, not as a participant, but as an observer, as if waiting for something or someone to slip. On the other side, Margaret Dunhill busied herself arranging the teacups with a delicate precision, yet the slight hesitation in her hand when she passed by. Rosalind did not go unnoticed. It was a hesitation only the keenest eye could catch. And there was one such eye here, Vivian Wakefield. She was the kind of woman people overlooked, polite and unassuming, but her mind was a collection of puzzle pieces, each movement, each flicker of emotion catalogued in silence. Then the scream shattered the fragile calm. Gerald Whitmore, who had been nothing more than another guest moments ago, now lay sprawled on the ground. His eyes were wide, his hands limp against the sand, his face frozen in an expression of terror. Margaret let out another strangled cry, but before she could draw too much attention, Edmund was beside her, gripping her arm firmly. "Enough," he murmured, voice low but commanding, "no need for theatrics." And that was when the first realization struck, not that Gerald was dead, but that no one seemed truly shocked by it. Rosalind's face remained frozen, but her eyes gleamed with something unreadable. Edmund's lips twitched as if he were suppressing a smirk. Margaret had gone pale, yet she had not moved to touch Gerald, had not even knelt beside him in distress. Only Vivian stepped forward, but merely to observe. "Has anyone called for a doctor?" someone asked. No one answered. The salty air was no longer the only thing lingering in the breeze. Now there was something else, an unspoken tension, a knowing silence, a shift in the very fabric of the gathering. Vivian exhaled slowly. This wasn't an accident, and suddenly this picnic was no longer just a picnic. It was a trap, a carefully orchestrated performance, one that had only just begun. The afternoon sun bathed the cliffside in a deceptive golden hue, the sea stretching out in quiet indifference, as though it hadn't swallowed more than its share of secrets. The air carried the scent of salt and something else, something unseen, but no less tangible. It lingered between the guests, nestled in the pauses of their conversations, in the barely concealed glances, in the way a few hands trembled ever so slightly when reaching for a glass of chilled wine. This was not merely a gathering, it was a stage, and every single person present was a player in a game they hadn't yet admitted to playing. Margaret Whitmore smiled as she poured herself another drink, though her fingers curled a fraction too tight around the crystal stem. Across from her, Lawrence Devereux leaned lazily against a wooden post, the weight of his gaze pressing onto the rest of them like an unspoken accusation. "You do enjoy your little gatherings, don't you, Margaret?" he mused, his voice smooth but lacking warmth. "But I wonder, do you enjoy them for the company, or for the control?" The question settled over the table like a thick fog, curling into the silence it left behind. Margaret merely lifted a delicate brow. "Control? What a peculiar thing to suggest, Lawrence." She sipped her drink slowly, deliberately, as if savoring more than just the flavor. Further down the table, Eleanor Vance adjusted the lace on her sleeve, her eyes darting toward Victor Bellamy, who had remained unusually quiet throughout the afternoon. He sat at the edge of the gathering, his presence a shadow that no one quite knew how to acknowledge. When he finally spoke, it was with the precision of a knife slipping between ribs. "If anyone here enjoys control, Margaret, it certainly isn't you." The tension rippled outward, barely concealed behind forced chuckles and murmured protests, but it was there, pulsing, waiting. Then, as though the air itself had grown too thick, the moment broke. A sharp cry tore through the gathering. Everyone turned. Thomas Leland stood, his chair scraping violently against the wooden floor. His face had lost all color, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. He reached out blindly, clutching at his throat as if some invisible force were dragging the air from his lungs, and then he collapsed. For a moment, no one moved. It was the kind of stillness that came not from shock, but from calculation, from recognition. Then the chaos began, chairs shoved back, voices raised, someone calling for help. Margaret knelt beside him, pressing trembling fingers against his neck. Then she looked up. "He's gone." Eleanor exhaled sharply, her hand flying to her mouth. Lawrence's smirk had vanished. Bellamy remained where he was, watching with an unreadable expression, but his hands they had curled into tight fists at his sides. This was no accident. Vivienne Holt, who had been silent all evening, finally spoke. Her voice was calm, too calm. Someone knew this would happen, and just like that, the performance was over. The game had begun in earnest. The sea stretched endlessly before them, its surface a mirror of the sky, deceptively calm. The air smelled of salt, and something else, something uneasy. At first glance, the gathering had all the hallmarks of a pleasant seaside affair. Delicate teacups balanced on napkin-covered laps, the occasional burst of laughter punctuating the hum of conversation, and the sun casting long golden rays across the sand. But beneath that veneer of civility, a different current ran, a silent tension threading its way through every glance, every hesitant sip of tea, every carefully measured word. Isabel Harrington sat slightly apart from the others, her wide-brimmed hat shading her sharp, watchful eyes. She had learned long ago that the best way to gather secrets was to let people forget she was there, and secrets, she knew, were thick in the air today. Across from her, Henry Ashford, a man with the arrogance of old money and the ambition of someone who never had to ask twice, lounged in a wooden chair, watching the others as if he were a hunter among unsuspecting prey. "Charming, isn't it?" he mused, swirling the drink in his hand. "How people smile and sip their tea as if nothing is amiss." Next to him, Vivian Lancaster stiffened, the slight movement almost imperceptible, but Isabel saw it, just as she saw the way Vivian's fingers curled ever so slightly into the folds of her silk dress. "Nothing is amiss," Vivian replied, her voice smooth but too carefully controlled. "A pleasant afternoon among friends, that's all this is." Henry chuckled, a sound entirely devoid of warmth. "Friends," he echoed, as if the word itself amused him. He turned his gaze to Christopher Vale, who had been unusually quiet, his gaze fixed on the waves beyond. "What do you think, Christopher? Are we all simply enjoying the sun, or is there something more at play?" Christopher finally turned, his dark eyes unreadable. "You tell me, Henry," he said, his voice low. "You're the one who always seems to know more than you should." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, no one spoke. Then, like the snap of a thread stretched too tight, the moment broke. Across the table, Eleanor Whitby suddenly stood, her hands trembling as she reached for the glass before her. "Enough," she said, though her voice held no real authority. "We didn't come here to dredge up old wounds, didn't we?" Henry said softly. His gaze flicked briefly toward Isabel, sharp and knowing. She met it evenly, giving nothing away. A gust of wind rattled the glasses on the table, and in the silence that followed, Isabel felt a shift. The precise moment when the weight of unspoken truths became too heavy to bear. Somewhere in the distance the tide was rising, creeping closer, something was coming, and by the time the sun set over the horizon, she had no doubt one of them would not leave this place unscathed. The sea air was thick with the scent of salt, and something heavier, something unseen yet unmistakable. The gathering by the cove had started with all the forced politeness of such affairs, glasses clinking, laughter lilting at just the right moments. But beneath the pleasant facade, something simmered. Eleanor Marchmont sat a little apart from the others, her fingers delicately tracing the rim of her glass, her expression unreadable. She had always preferred to observe rather than engage, and today there was much to observe. Across from her, James Lockwood lounged with practiced ease, his dark eyes scanning the group with an almost imperceptible sharpness. "Interesting company," he murmured, just loud enough for Eleanor to hear. "I wonder how many of them actually like each other." The question was more than idle curiosity. The tension in the air had only grown as the afternoon wore on. The first crack had come when Margaret Bell, with just a little too much enthusiasm, inquired whether Celeste Olden and Victor Halloway were to be wed. Celeste Aston, ever the poised socialite, had smiled, too brightly, too quickly. "I'm not sure where you've heard such a thing," she had said, her voice smooth, but her fingers betrayed her, twisting the lace of her sleeve. Across from her, Victor had merely tilted his glass, his silence more damning than any confirmation. Eleanor had noticed it all, the way Celeste's gaze flickered toward Victor before she forced herself to look away. The way Victor had studied his drink, his knuckles slightly tense around the stem of his glass. Whatever existed between them, it was not as simple as mere engagement rumors. And then there was Graham Weatherby, the hotel manager, whose nervous glances toward Victor had not gone unnoticed. He had laughed, a little too loudly, as he reached for a sandwich, declaring, "Just a misunderstanding, surely, we're all friends here." But his voice wavered, and his hands trembled slightly as he poured his tea. Eleanor knew a drowning man when she saw one. As the sun lowered, the small groups that had formed shifted, conversations fading into whispers carried by the wind. Victor and Captain Sterling broke away from the main gathering, their footsteps crunching against the rocks. Eleanor watched as Victor's expression darkened, his voice carrying just enough for her to catch its edge. "You'll regret interfering, Sterling." The captain didn't flinch. "I've dealt with men like you before," he said, his voice steady but tight. "I know exactly what you're after." Victor chuckled, a low, humorless sound. "No you don't," he said softly, "but you will." The words sent a chill through Eleanor. This wasn't about mere business dealings or seaside rumors. This was personal, a battle of power, and she suspected neither man would back down easily. She glanced towards Celeste, who stood frozen, staring at the two men, her mask slipping just enough for Eleanor to see it. Fear. Something was coming. She could feel it in the stillness that followed, in the way the tide crept closer, as if waiting to wash away whatever was left behind. The wind had changed. Eleanor Marchmont felt it before she saw it, an eerie shift in the rhythm of the waves, as if the sea itself had sensed the darkness that had crept upon the gathering. The picnic, once lively with forced pleasantries and laughter that never quite reached the eyes, had begun to dissolve into scattered conversations and restless wanderings along the rocky shoreline. Yet beneath the surface of polite chatter, something simmered, tension, unspoken and thick, hummed in the air like a coming storm. Secrets lay buried in the sand, waiting for the tide to uncover them. She watched as Victor Halloway stood apart, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his shoulders rigid, his hands shoved into the pockets of his pristine linen suit as if bracing himself against an invisible force. Celeste Alden, her usual grace betrayed by the tight clasp of her hands, stood a few feet away, fingers woven together so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Nearby, Graham Weatherby, the hotel manager, seemed a little too preoccupied with smoothing out the wrinkles in his vest, his usual composed demeanor betrayed by the nervous tapping of his fingers against his thigh. Every now and then his eyes flicked toward Edward Bellamy, the man who had spent the afternoon at the center of every whispered exchange. Bellamy, with his effortless charm and quiet authority, the kind of man who could turn fortunes with a single conversation, stood near the water's edge, seemingly oblivious to the quiet storm brewing behind him. The unease in the air was thick, pressing against the guests like a force of nature, the kind of weight that made every breath feel heavier, every movement slower. Eleanor wasn't the only one who noticed. Even the waves had lost their rhythm, their steady crash against the shore now broken, irregular, as if they too sensed that something was about to break. She had just begun gathering the remnants of the meal, empty glasses, half-eaten sandwiches, a forgotten silk napkin fluttering in the breeze when it happened. A scream, piercing raw, sliced through the air, shattering the fragile illusion of peace. It wasn't the kind of scream that came from a mere shock, it was terror, deep, soul-shaking terror. The gathering froze, a single name carried on the wind, panic woven into every syllable. Edward, a woman's voice, high and trembling. Someone stumbled backward, someone else gasped, heads turned toward the sea. Eleanor moved before she even registered the thought, stepping around the overturned glasses and plates, past the stunned expressions of the guests now locked onto the shoreline. And there he was, Edward Bellamy, floating face up in the shallows, his once bronze skin now pale and waxy beneath the waning sunlight. The water lapped gently at his lifeless form, nudging him like a careless lover, as if whispering secrets only the dead could hear. His dark hair fanned out around him, the waves tugging at his limp arms, his mouth slightly open, frozen mid-breath. But there was no breath. The silence that followed was worse than the scream. It was the silence of held breaths, of minds scrambling to make sense of the inevitable. Someone sobbed. Someone muttered a prayer under their breath. But Eleanor's gaze was not on the body, it was on the faces around her, the tiny flickers of something more than shock. Captain Sterling stood rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles in his face twitched. His eyes, dark and stormy, were unreadable, but Eleanor saw the flicker of something in them. Recognition, resignation. Celeste Alden took a slow step backward, her hand clutching at the pearls around her neck, her lips slightly parted as if she had just realized something terrible, something inevitable. Graham Weatherby's eyes darted from the body to the guests, then back again. He swallowed hard, his throat bobbing, his fingers curling into his palm, as if trying to grasp something, an explanation, perhaps. Or an alibi. Someone whispered, "What happened?" But Eleanor knew, this was no accident. Edward Bellamy had not simply drowned, he had been silenced. And the real question was not what had happened, but who among them had finally found the courage, or the desperation to end it. The tide had turned, not just in the sea but in the atmosphere that clung thick around them, unseen but suffocating. Eleanor Marchmont, standing at the periphery of the gathering, felt it before the others did, the slow but deliberate shift in the air, as if the universe itself had exhaled, knowing that something irreversible had just unfolded. The sky was too blue, the waves too rhythmic, a cruel contrast to the chaos now creeping through the unsuspecting crowd. A single scream had fractured the brittle silence, its echo swallowed by the restless sea, but the weight of it remained, hanging in the air like the final note of a requiem. The guests had all turned toward the shoreline, expressions frozen in shock, in horror, in something deeper than mere surprise. And there he was, Oliver Darnley, floating face up in the shallows, his body eerily still, his limbs drifting with the current, like a marionette whose strings had been severed. His skin had taken on a ghastly pallor, his mouth slightly parted, as if caught mid-protest, mid-revelation, mid-breath that had never quite made it past his lips. The water lapped at him in quiet mockery, a cruel imitation of a lover's embrace, tugging at his motionless frame, as though urging him to rise, except he never would. The silence that followed was more telling than any cry could be. No one moved, no one spoke. The weight of realization pressed down upon them all, their collective breaths held in a way that felt less like reverence and more like fear. Eleanor did not look at the body. She had seen enough death to know what it meant, what it told her without ever speaking. Instead, she studied the faces around her, watched how the shock flickered through them, how some were too quick to hide their reactions, while others let their horror spill out too deliberately, too performatively. There was Celeste Alden, her usual composed grace shattered, her hands clenched into fists so tight that her nails had begun to bite into her own skin. The tremor in her breath betrayed her more than the tears that welled at the edges of her eyes. But were those tears for Oliver, or for something else entirely? Next to her, Victor Holloway stood unnaturally still, his gaze fixed on the body, but his jaw locked so tightly that Eleanor could see the tension in his temples, a man forcing himself to remain neutral, a man caught between what he had just witnessed, and what he had to pretend he hadn't. And then there was Charles Whitby, the hotel owner, his face ashen, his fingers twitching at his sides, as if fighting the instinct to wipe sweat from his brow. His eyes darted, not to the body, but to the others, scanning their reactions, gauging their responses, searching perhaps for the one who already knew too much. The constable arrived moments later, young and uncertain, the weight of his uniform seemingly too heavy for his shoulders. He stood at the edge of the group, struggling to command the moment, though it was clear to Eleanor that authority had already been lost to something greater, something older than the law, something written in the language of guilt and silence. He hesitated before speaking, before attempting to take control of the unraveling moment. "We need to determine what happened," he said, but his voice lacked conviction, his words as uncertain as his stance. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, watching as the guests, one by one, seemed to snap out of their paralysis, their carefully curated personas slipping just enough for her to glimpse the truth beneath. Some turned away, unable to stomach the sight. Others stepped forward, drawn not by concern but by something darker, something resembling curiosity. And then there were those who stayed frozen, not because of grief, but because they were already calculating their next move. A murmur spread through the crowd, low and hushed, a ripple of speculation. Someone whispered Oliver's name, testing the weight of it against the night air, as if saying it might make him real again. Someone else muttered about the tide, about how the sea had taken him. But Eleanor knew better. The sea did not take, it revealed. and Oliver had not simply drowned. She turned, locking eyes with the constable. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet but firm. "You'll find your answers not in the waves, but in the faces of those who stood by and watched." The young officer blinked at her, caught off guard by the certainty in her tone. He hesitated, unsure whether to challenge her insight or heed it. But Eleanor had no patience for hesitation. She already knew how this worked. Men like Oliver Darnley, men who held power, who knew things they shouldn't, who whispered the wrong secrets in the wrong ears, did not simply slip beneath the waves. They were sent there. The crowd around her had thickened, but their words had thinned, their voices dropping to nervous murmurs, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down like the tide, pulling at the shore. Eleanor watched them, watched how their feet shifted in the sand, how they avoided each other's gazes, how the unspoken rules of their carefully constructed world were now unraveling in real time. The way Celeste avoided looking at Victor, the way Charles kept glancing at the constable, as if gauging how much he already suspected, the way Victor's hands, now clenched at his sides, were trembling just slightly. The constable had begun taking statements, but Eleanor wasn't listening to the words. They were meaningless now, lies wrapped in concern, deceptions disguised as grief. She was watching for the spaces between the words, the things left unsaid, the flickers of guilt and fear that told her more than any confession ever could. The pieces were already shifting into place. Greed, jealousy, fear, they ran beneath this village like an unseen current, pulling everything toward inevitable ruin. The question was not who had wanted Oliver dead. There were too many answers to that. The real question was what secret had been worth killing for, and that was the answer she would find, not in the body floating at the shore, but in the eyes of those still standing. And so it began, not with a scream, but with silence. The body lay sprawled on the jagged rocks where the tide had abandoned it, face turned toward the storm-heavy sky, eyes open, lips slightly parted, as if death had caught him mid-confession. A man of means, of influence, of carefully cultivated enemies. Henry Langford had not merely drowned, he had been discarded, tossed like refuse by hands that had no desire to see him float back to the surface. Around him the air thrummed with something electric, a tension thick enough to cut with a blade. No one spoke at first, not truly. Eleanor Vale watched them with the same patience she reserved for liars at the card table, her dark eyes flitting from face to face, catching the nuances they believed went unnoticed. The trembling hand of Mrs. Whitmore as she clutched her scarf too tightly, the sudden nervous swallow of Jasper Flynn, the way Nathaniel Burke's gaze flickered from the body to the restless sea beyond, as if calculating what the waves might still reveal. These were not the reactions of grief-stricken onlookers. These were people who had been waiting for this moment, some with dread, some with quiet satisfaction. The constable arrived in a hurry, but his presence did little to settle the unease. He fumbled with his notepad, barking out questions in a voice too unsteady for authority. Was he alone? He asked, though he already knew the answer. Did anyone see him fall? But the words felt hollow, because Henry Langford had not fallen. He had been pushed, whether by force or circumstance. Eleanor was not yet certain. She only knew that in this gathering of the privileged and the restless, innocence was a rare and fragile thing. She moved closer, her gloved fingers brushing against the damp fabric of Langford's sleeve. The body was stiffening, but not from the cold. He had been dead longer than they realized. Someone delayed this discovery, she murmured, more to herself than to the constable. A delay meant intent. A delay meant time. Time to hide, to adjust, to make it seem as though fate had intervened rather than human hands. She straightened, meeting the wary eyes of those around her. "We all know Henry Langford," she said, her voice measured, calm. "We all know the kind of man he was. He did not meet the sea on accident." A ripple passed through the group, a shudder of discomfort. No one argued. No one denied it. Instead, they shifted, glancing toward one another, seeking an anchor in a storm they had not prepared for. The game had begun. The question was not whether one of them had killed him, but who had the most to lose if the truth came to light. The tide had already begun its slow retreat, dragging the evidence of the night's crime back into the depths, but the body, broken, discarded, unnervingly still, remained as an undeniable testament to what had transpired. Samuel Harding, a man known for his precision, his ruthless business acumen, and the grudges he carried like fine-tailored suits, lay sprawled where the sea had abandoned him, half submerged in the wet sand, his face frozen in an expression that suggested he had realized, far too late, the fatal miscalculation that had sealed his fate. Eleanor Graves stepped forward, her sharp eyes sweeping across the gathered faces, none of them quite meeting hers. There was the weight of something unspoken in the air, a tension that pressed against the silence like a blade against skin. No one wept, no one dared to speak first. Harding had not been a man who inspired mourning, but his death unsettled them. The constable, young and far too fresh-faced for the likes of this crowd, cleared his throat, adjusting his cap with hands that trembled only slightly. Did anyone see what happened? A pointless question. Eleanor watched as glances were exchanged, as lips parted and closed again, calculations flickering behind wary gazes. Not a soul here would admit to seeing anything. Seeing meant involvement, and involvement was a dangerous thing when men like Harding were involved. A dreadful accident, murmured Frances Whitmore, her voice just a touch too composed, her hands clasped so tightly around the delicate lace of her gloves that her knuckles turned white. She turned her eyes toward the sea, as though the waves might absolve her of whatever thought had just crossed her mind. Yes, agreed Thomas Redford, the hotel's manager, a man whose livelihood had always depended on keeping unpleasantness out of sight. A terrible accident, but Eleanor knew better. Accidents did not leave bruises along a man's jaw. Accidents did not snap a watch from his wrist and leave it discarded, its cracked face buried in the damp earth beside him. An accident certainly did not result in the kind of fear that now coiled itself around these people, tightening with each second of silence. The footprints, faint, hurried, led away from the body, vanishing into the cover of the cliffs. Someone had been here after the deed was done, someone who had lingered just long enough to ensure Harding would not rise again. Eleanor stepped closer, crouching beside the body, her fingers brushing over a fragment of torn fabric caught in the rocks. The color was distinct, dark and rich, a fabric of wealth, of status. Her lips pressed into a thin line. The truth was here, lying in the details, in the way Redford's voice wavered on the edges of forced indifference, in the nervous way Frances avoided looking at Harding's shattered timepiece, in the tension that thrummed beneath Captain Lovell's otherwise still posture. The guilty were always too careful, too measured. The innocent, if any such thing still existed here, were already drowning in the currents of a story they did not yet understand. The constable was still asking questions, but Eleanor had stopped listening. She was watching, waiting, because the truth never came from what people said, it came from what they tried so desperately to hide. The waves whispered secrets to the shore, pulling back ever so slightly to reveal the truth left behind in the damp sand. The body of Leonard Graves lay half in, half out of the tide, the once pristine fabric of his suit stained with salt and shadow, his watch gold cracked and frozen at an impossible hour, glinted mockingly beneath the moonlight. It had not been the sea that had claimed him. No, the water had merely been the last to touch him, an unwitting accomplice to a crime carefully planned, meticulously executed. Eleanor Hawthorne stood a few paces away, her expression unreadable as she studied the gathered faces. The whispers had begun before the constable even arrived, low murmurs of speculation, of fear, of the desperate need to construct a version of events that would make sense, one that would keep them safe. But there was no safety in this, not for any of them. Edgar Whitby, the host of the ill-fated evening's gathering, shifted uneasily. His hands, usually so steady, betrayed him as he adjusted the cuff of his sleeve, fingers fumbling over the button. Beside him, Celeste Vaughan, her lips parted as though caught mid-thought, did not speak. Her eyes flitted between the body and the others, calculating, searching for some unspoken confirmation that she was not alone in whatever terrible knowledge she carried. Henry Caldwell's stance was too firm, too controlled, shoulders squared, jaw tight, as though bracing for a blow. And then there was Alice Munro, standing at the edge of the group, her arms folded tightly across her chest, her breath shallow, her gaze locked on Graves as if she could will the sight of him away. She had been the first to cry out when they'd stumbled upon the scene, but Eleanor had not missed the hesitation in her voice, the fraction of a second too long before the scream. The constable finally arrived, breathless, his uniform damp with mist and exertion. He took one look at the body and swallowed hard, his gaze darting uncertainly toward the others before focusing on the single figure who had yet to speak. Eleanor, but she was not watching him. Her attention had shifted to the ground, to the footprints leading away from the tide, imprints that told the story no one else dared to speak. The sand, still wet and heavy, preserved them well. Someone had been here after Graves had fallen, and they had left in a hurry, not toward the house, not toward safety, but toward the abandoned jetty where the boats had been moored hours before. A torn scrap of silk, deep crimson, clung to the jagged rocks near the shoreline. Eleanor knelt, brushing away the damp sand as she retrieved it, the fabric delicate yet unmistakably torn with force. She held it up just as a sharp gasp came from Celeste, who instinctively clutched at her own sleeve, one that matched the very color of the fragment in Eleanor's hand. The silence that followed was not the silence of shock, nor grief. It was the silence of realization, of a collective understanding that the truth, unwelcome as it was, had just begun to unfold. The sea would not wash this away. It never did. The murmurs of the gathered crowd were as restless as the sea, shifting and swelling in uneasy waves. The body of Victor Holloway lay on the shore, his fine coat damp with salt and sand, his watch cracked and stilled at an impossible hour, bearing silent witness to the crime that had played out beneath the indifferent stars. But this was no accident, no simple misstep into the water. Eleanor Vance knew that much without needing to hear the weak proclamations of the authorities. She had seen too many deaths wrapped in convenient explanations to believe them at face value, and yet Inspector Darrow was already shaping the narrative to his liking, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd, not for truth, but for the easiest resolution. "Unfortunate," he muttered, brushing the damp from his coat, as if the very air of the place unsettled him. A man of his standing, likely too confident in these waters, a misjudgment in the dark. His words trailed off as if he had already decided the matter was closed, but Eleanor saw the way his fingers tapped against his arm. A tell, a nervous habit. He wasn't entirely convinced, not yet, but doubt was an inconvenience he had no time for. The crowd shifted, whispering among themselves, some stepping back, unwilling to be drawn into the matter any further. But there were always those who lingered, those who knew that in this town, things were rarely as simple as they seemed. Samuel Wright, the manager of the Holloway estate, was among them, his hands clasped tightly behind his back, his expression a carefully constructed mask of concern, too careful. His gaze flickered toward the body, only briefly before darting to the others, as if measuring their reactions, searching for an unspoken understanding. Beside him, Margaret Langley, the ever-graceful socialite, stood too still, her delicate hands twisting the fabric of her dress in a nervous gesture she likely wasn't even aware of. Her lips parted, but no words came, not yet. James Radcliffe, a man whose very presence carried the weight of old money and older grudges, exhaled sharply through his nose, his irritation evident. But it was not the irritation of grief. No, this was something else. Annoyance, inconvenience. And then there was Lillian Graves, standing at the very edge of the gathering, her dark eyes fixed on the waves, her face unreadable. She had not spoken a word since they had found the body. Eleanor did not offer her thoughts aloud, not yet. Instead she allowed the silence to stretch, waiting for the weight of it to push them toward conversation. People had a way of revealing themselves when left alone with their own discomfort. Instead, she turned her attention to the ground, to the details others overlooked. A disturbance in the sand, footprints leading toward the rocky outcrop, but not away. A handkerchief, fine silk, embroidered initials barely visible against the darkened fabric, caught between the jagged edges of a stone. The scent of expensive cologne clung to it still. Eleanor knelt, retrieving the fabric with deliberate care, turning it over in her fingers as the threads of the mystery began to weave together in her mind. When she looked up, she met the eyes of Margaret Langley, and in that moment she saw it, the flicker of recognition, the sharp inhale, the tightening of her shoulders. It was small, but it was enough. Eleanor allowed herself a slight, knowing smile. The story was unfolding, and soon enough, every hidden thread would be pulled into the light. The town of Blackwood Heath held its secrets as tightly as the storm-laden clouds that loomed above, thick with the weight of something unsaid. The body of Leonard Vaughan lay at the edge of the garden terrace, his hand still clutching a shattered brandy glass, his lifeless eyes reflecting the flickering gas lamps that lined the grand estate. The guests who had gathered for the evening's soiree stood frozen in a tableau of shock and whispered speculation. Inspector Graves was already shaping his conclusion, his keen eyes scanning the room not for the truth, but for the simplest explanation. "A tragic accident," he muttered, his voice clipped with the efficiency of a man eager to close a case before it had begun. "A misstep, perhaps. The stones are slick, and the hour was late." But Eleanor Pinch did not believe in missteps. Not the kind that ended in shattered glass and still warm bodies. She stood at the edge of the crime scene, her sharp gaze flickering between the guests. There was Vincent Langley, Vaughan's oldest associate, his face a careful mask of grief, yet his fingers tapped impatiently against his cuff. A man with too much to lose, too many investments tied to Vaughan's decisions. Next to him, Beatrice Holloway, Vaughan's former fiancée, her hands clasped so tightly around her silk scarf that her knuckles had turned white. She had left him years ago, but scorn had a way of lingering like an old wound. Across the room, Julian Mercer, the ambitious young architect, whose project Vaughan had recently blocked, stood stiff-backed and unreadable. A fortune made, or lost on the whim of one man. And then there was Isabel Thorne, standing slightly apart from the others, her dark eyes fixed on Vaughan's body, her expression unreadable. She had been the last to speak with him, the last to see him alive. Eleanor did not announce her thoughts aloud, instead she let the silence work for her, the weight of the moment pressing down on them all. People had a way of unraveling under silence, filling the empty space with words they had not meant to say. She turned her attention to the details others overlooked, the splash of dark liquid on the marble, the disturbance in the gravel leading toward the terrace's edge, the faint scent of cigar smoke mixed with something sharper, something metallic. And then just at the base of the stone balustrade, something small caught her eye, a torn scrap of fabric, dark with moisture, caught between the grooves of the railing. She retrieved it carefully, running her fingers over the fine embroidery. The initials barely visible, but telling. She looked up, locking eyes with Beatrice Holloway, and in that fleeting moment she saw it. A flicker of recognition, a sharp intake of breath, the way she tucked her scarf tighter around her neck. It was small, but it was enough. The storm outside had yet to break, but Eleanor knew one thing with certainty: the night was far from over, and before it ended, the truths hidden within Blackwood Heath would come tumbling out like a house of cards caught in the wind. The morning mist curled low over the rolling hills of Raven's Hollow, carrying with it the whispers of a night gone wrong. The body of Reginald Hargrove lay sprawled on the damp cobblestone path behind his grand estate, his expensive waistcoat soaked through with rain and something far darker. His lifeless fingers still clutched the remnants of a shattered pocket watch, the cracked glass glinting in the pale dawn light. The villagers gathered in uneasy clusters beyond the wrought iron gates, their murmurs rising like the wind before a storm. It was an accident, the constable had said, a misstep in the rain perhaps. But Evelyn Harrow knew better. She watched from the edge of the crowd, her sharp mind ticking through the details as others gawked in horror. Reginald Hargrove had been a man of influence, a landowner whose ambitions stretched beyond the boundaries of the Hollow, a man with powerful friends, and even more powerful enemies. His sudden demise was not merely an unfortunate twist of fate. No, this was something else. The work of careful hands and calculated timing. Evelyn let her gaze drift over the assembled figures, noting the expressions, the gestures, the shifts in posture that spoke volumes more than words ever could. There was Sebastian Vance, Hargrove's longtime business rival, standing stiff-backed and grim-faced, his jaw locked so tight it could have shattered stone. He had fought Hargrove at every turn, opposing his plans to build a railway through the valley, a project that would have stripped away the untouched beauty of Raven's Hollow in favor of cold, hard industry. His opposition had been fierce, but had it been desperate enough to kill? Then there was Eleanor Sinclair, the widow with a past as tangled as the ivy that climbed the walls of the old manor. She had once been close to Hargrove, years ago before their whispered alliance had crumbled into public disgrace. Her eyes, usually unreadable, flickered just a second too long over the broken pocket watch in the victim's hand before she quickly looked away. A memory, perhaps, or a reminder of something she had hoped would stay buried. Nearby, the ever-nervous Simon Kent fidgeted with the brim of his hat, his gaze darting toward the exit of the garden, where muddy footprints trailed into the mist. He had always been Hargrove's shadow, his accountant, his confidant, the keeper of his many secrets. But loyalty had its limits, and debts, especially those measured in gold and desperation, had a way of turning even the most devoted into something else entirely. And then there was Isadora Bell, the quiet storm among them. She had been the last to see Hargrove alive, her voice the final echo he had heard before he stumbled into the night. She was composed, too composed, standing with an air of detachment that did not belong to someone mourning the loss of a friend. Evelyn watched her fingers tighten around the delicate silver chain at her throat, the slight quiver in her breath, when the constable spoke of the fall. It was not sorrow she concealed, it was something else. Evelyn exhaled slowly, letting the pieces settle into place. The night had been long, the storm unforgiving, but the truth was far from washed away. It lingered in the damp footprints, the broken watch, the whispered glances exchanged between the living. This was no accident, no mere misstep. Someone had guided Hargrove's fall with careful intent, and before the day was done, Evelyn Harrow would know who. She had solved more intricate puzzles before, but this was personal. She turned away from the crowd, already envisioning the next steps. She would visit the estate, speak to the staff, retrace Hargrove's final moments. The murderer had made their move, but they had underestimated her. A crime woven with secrecy could only hold its shape for so long before unraveling at the hands of those who knew where to pull the thread. And Evelyn, she was ready to begin. The air inside the Hastings manor sat heavy with an uneasy stillness, the kind that clung to the walls long after a crime had been committed. The scent of old wood and faintly perfumed tea curled through the drawing room, as Eleanor Vale poured the amber liquid into delicate porcelain cups, her movements practiced, precise. Strange, isn't it? She mused, her voice smooth, as though speaking of the weather and not the cold corpse that had been discovered the night before. One moment, a man is very much alive, speaking, moving about, and then suddenly, she set the teapot down with a quiet click, her lips curving into a humorless smile. He's just gone. Across from her, Inspector Lucian Graves studied her through the rising steam, his sharp gaze catching the flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. Yes, he murmured, it does make one wonder how quickly life can change. He took a sip, watching as Eleanor's fingers tapped idly against the rim of her saucer, deliberate, measured, as if she were counting seconds in her head. Beyond the windows, The vast expanse of the sea stretched endlessly, its waves lapping against the shore, in a rhythm that had remained unchanged, despite the violent end of Lord Everett Hargrove. A man of means, power, and if rumours were to be believed, a great many enemies. His body had been found at dawn, slumped over the balustrade of his grand estate, a shattered glass lying near his outstretched hand. A fall, the authorities had called it, a terrible accident, but Lucian Graves had not spent years untangling lies to be fooled by such a simple illusion. There were too many contradictions, too many carefully placed missteps. He had already spoken to the guests, each of them as composed as one could be when under suspicion. Sebastian Holt, Hargrove's once trusted business associate, had been conveniently absent from the gathering for a significant window of time, his excuse as flimsy as the ledgers that had, just weeks ago, revealed discrepancies in Hargrove's financial dealings. Then there was Marian Holloway, the poised widow who had maintained a peculiar detachment throughout the investigation, her only betrayal being the nervous way she glanced toward the grand staircase whenever the topic of the murder was raised. And of course, there was Theo Ashford, the ever-loyal steward, whose devotion to Hargrove had on more than one occasion spilled over into anger, especially when it came to matters of inheritance. Lucian let the silence stretch, watching as Eleanor Vale's perfectly controlled mask did not falter, but instead shifted, ever so slightly. "You were seen," he said, voice quiet, calculated, leaving Lord Hargrove's study late in the evening. "Strange, considering you had claimed to have retired early." A flicker, barely there but enough. "I was looking for a book," she replied smoothly. But there was something new in her tone, something guarded. "And I suppose that book was worth the trouble of creeping down the hall unnoticed." Lucian's lips quirked slightly, the weight of his words settling between them like an unsaid accusation. The wind outside howled, rattling the old panes as if the manor itself wished to shake loose the truth. Each suspect had something to lose, something to hide, but only one of them had been willing to take a life to keep their secret buried. Lord Hargrove had not simply stumbled, he had been helped, pushed, his death as intentional as the silence that followed it. And Lucian Graves, ever patient, ever watchful, knew that before the sun set again, he would have the answer. Lies unraveled like poorly woven fabric, and this mystery was already beginning to fray at the seams. The morning tide had barely begun to retreat, when Evelyn Graves stepped onto the deserted shore, the damp sand cool beneath her measured steps. The waves whispered secrets against the jagged rocks, carrying with them the ghost of the night before, a night that had ended with the lifeless body of Victor Langley washing ashore, his coat heavy with water, his pockets emptied of everything but a torn page from a ledger and a single silver cufflink. An accident, they murmured, a tragic misstep. But Evelyn had spent too many years peeling back the layers of carefully curated lies to believe in such convenient explanations. She crouched near the surf, her gloved fingers brushing the wet imprint of footprints leading toward the old watchtower, half buried by the wind-swept dunes. Someone had been here after midnight, long after Langley was presumed to have drowned. As the morning light sharpened the edges of the crumbling tower, Evelyn noticed a glint beneath the worn wooden steps, a small bloodied shard of glass, its edges too precise, too deliberately placed. She tucked it into her pocket, her mind already assembling the threads of deception. The guests at Ravenshade Manor had been quick to express their shock, but their words had been too carefully chosen, their grief too perfectly measured. Jonathan Ward, Langley's business partner, had been particularly insistent on the notion that Langley had been drinking before his fall, yet the glass from Langley's study had been found on the mantel, untouched. Amelia Forsyth, the widow with a reputation for discretion, had been seen slipping away from the gathering just before midnight, her silk shawl damp when she returned, and Henry Caldwell, the ever-loyal steward, had been uncharacteristically silent, his usual meticulous demeanor betraying an edge of nervous energy. Evelyn walked the path leading back to the manor, her eyes tracing the subtle betrayals, scattered sand near the back entrance, the lingering scent of tobacco where none should be. The parlor was quiet when she entered, save for the steady ticking of the grand clock. Amelia sat near the window, her fingers delicately tracing the rim of her teacup, though she had yet to take a sip. A restless night, Evelyn mused, settling into the chair across from her. Amelia's eyes flickered, just for a moment. "It's dreadful, truly," she murmured. "To think Victor met such an end." "Indeed," Evelyn said smoothly. "Strange though that no one saw him leave." A pause, a hesitation, the kind that spoke louder than words. "He was alone, I'm sure of it," Amelia replied. "Too quickly, was he?" Evelyn leaned forward slightly, her voice as soft as the sea breeze that curled through the half-opened window. "Or did someone ensure that he would be?" The silence stretched, the weight of truth pressing against the walls of the room. Somewhere in this house lay the answer, wrapped in half-spoken confessions and calculated omissions, and Evelyn Graves had all the patience in the world to unravel every last thread. The air inside the boathouse was thick with the scent of damp wood and salt water, the silence stretching unnaturally, as Miss Eleanor Graves turned sharply at the sound of approaching footsteps. A shadow flickered against the dim light filtering through the wooden slats, and a moment later, Caroline Devol hesitated at the doorway, her pale face drawn tight with unease. Eleanor had seen that same expression before, nervous, wary, but something else as well, something buried deeper. Caroline's eyes darted toward the floor before locking onto Eleanor's with a fleeting moment of hesitation, her fingers twitching at the edge of her silk scarf, a nervous habit Eleanor had observed more than once. "I didn't expect anyone to be here," Caroline murmured, her voice unsteady, barely above a whisper. She took a cautious step forward, her gaze flickering toward the old wooden crate in the corner, where the damp floorboards held a faint imprint of something recently moved. Eleanor didn't shift from where she stood, her posture calm but watchful, her mind already turning over possibilities. "I've been here for some time," she said smoothly, her tone deliberately light, masking the weight of her scrutiny. "Just looking around, but I imagine you must have a reason to be here at this hour." Caroline hesitated again, her breath catching just slightly before she exhaled, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to be lurking just beyond the door. "I came to retrieve something of Mr. Bellamy's, a small box he kept hidden here," she finally admitted, voice faltering. Eleanor arched an eyebrow, her gaze sharpening. "A box?" Caroline nodded quickly, too quickly. "Yes. He stashed it away, and now it's mine." The words came out flat, forced, almost rehearsed. Eleanor let the silence stretch between them, observing the way Caroline's shoulders stiffened, the slight tremor in her hands as she clenched the fabric of her scarf. Fear. Not grief. Not sadness. Fear. "Do you mind if I ask what was inside?" Eleanor's voice was gentle, coaxing, her own posture unreadable. Caroline's gaze flickered toward the door again, before she shook her head. "Nothing important," she said, but her voice betrayed her. "Letters. A few documents. Just personal things." Her words tumbled out too quickly, as if she needed to end the conversation before it spiraled out of her control. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, considering. Bellamy had been cruel to her, that much had been evident, but there was something deeper lurking beneath the surface of her words, something she wasn't saying. "So you weren't upset to hear about his passing?" Eleanor asked smoothly, her expression unreadable. Caroline flinched, just barely, before forcing a brittle smile. "I didn't want him dead," she said, her voice tight. "But I'm relieved I won't be forced into an engagement I never wanted." Her throat bobbed slightly as she swallowed. "He was controlling, manipulative. You don't understand what it's like to be trapped by someone like him." Eleanor nodded, her expression softening slightly though her thoughts spun in another direction. Caroline had been a victim, but much was certain, but she was also hiding something. The timing, the way the events had unfolded so neatly. Eleanor had seen too many cases like this, when fear and desperation twisted into something else entirely. As Caroline turned to leave, the door creaked behind her, the soft sound of her hurried footsteps fading into the night. Eleanor remained in place, alone in the boathouse, her eyes drifting back to the crate Caroline had been fixated on. The damp patch on the floor, the way the rope inside had been left tangled, not discarded. She knelt, brushing her fingers against the wood, noting the faint smear of something darker, something that had dried too quickly to be simple river water. And then she saw it, a single button wedged between the slats of the floor, half hidden beneath the crate. A small detail, almost insignificant. But Eleanor knew better. The pieces were shifting into place. Bellamy had been a strong swimmer. He wouldn't have simply slipped beneath the water on his own. No, he had been rendered unconscious first, then dragged. The rope had been a final touch, used to control the narrative, to ensure no one saw the struggle that had come before. The murder had been planned, staged, and now with Caroline's uneasy confession and the secrets buried in that missing box, Eleanor was closer than ever to unraveling the tangled web of deception. A heavy mist hung over the coastline as the tide whispered against the shore, the sky a deep shade of indigo before the morning light could break through. Eleanor Graves stood at the threshold of the abandoned watchtower, her silhouette barely distinguishable against the ruins. The wind howled through the cracks of the stone, carrying the scent of salt and something else, something more sinister. At her feet, half buried in the damp earth, was a glinting object. She crouched, brushing away the wet sand to reveal an ornate pocket watch, its glass cracked, its hands frozen at precisely 12:17, the time of death. The victim, Conrad Duval, had been found just hours before, his body floating in the inlet, his lungs filled with seawater, but the signs of struggle, bruises along his wrists, the unnatural angle of his fingers, suggested he hadn't simply drowned. No, someone had ensured he wouldn't see another sunrise. Eleanor's mind raced through the potential suspects. Lord Ashcombe, the man whose inheritance Duval had threatened, had a temper and a penchant for quieting problems before they escalated. Marion Tate, the widow with secrets locked behind her sorrowful eyes, had been seen arguing with Duval just days before. And then there was Victor Calloway, the reclusive lighthouse keeper, whose past tragedies tied him to the inlet, like an unbroken chain. Eleanor turned the watch over in her gloved hands, her mind assembling the puzzle with ruthless efficiency. A sound behind her snapped her attention back to the present. Footsteps, cautious and deliberate, echoed against the stone walls of the tower. She rose slowly, hiding the watch within her coat, as a shadow emerged from the mist. Miss Graves, a voice low and uncertain, called out. It was Marion Tate, her face pale, her fingers trembling as she clutched a faded handkerchief. I need to speak with you. There's something you should know about the night Conrad died. Eleanor's gaze sharpened, her pulse steady despite the sudden revelation. She had known Marion was hiding something, but the way her lips quivered, the way her eyes darted toward the inlet, told Eleanor this confession came at great personal cost. Go on, Eleanor urged, her voice smooth as steel. Marion hesitated, twisting the cloth in her hands before whispering. I wasn't the only one who saw Conrad that night. There was someone else at the docks, someone who had reason to want him dead. The mist thickened around them, as if the very air was conspiring to keep the truth at bay. Eleanor remained silent, allowing the tension to stretch, waiting for Marion to continue. And then just as she opened her mouth to speak, a distant splash echoed across the water, and a dark figure slipped from the shadows. Someone had been listening. Someone who didn't want the truth to come to light. Eleanor took a step forward, but the figure was already gone, vanished into the mist like a phantom. The hunt had just begun. The village of Ashford-on-Sea lay in deceptive tranquility beneath the fading afternoon sun, its cobbled streets bathed in golden light, masking the turmoil that lurked just beneath. The scent of salt lingered in the air, carried inland by the breeze from the restless waves that crashed against the jagged cliffs. From a distance, it was an idyllic place, a picture of English charm, where life moved at an unhurried pace. But today, beneath that picturesque surface, something sinister churned. The death of Charles Latimer had sent a ripple through the town, unsettling its carefully maintained order. Eleanor Graves sat in her study, her hands gloved as she examined the delicate yet damning piece of evidence between her fingers, a finely stitched handkerchief, embroidered with an insignia of a lighthouse. It was small, almost unnoticeable to the untrained eye, but for Eleanor, it was a silent confession, a whisper from the crime itself. The handkerchief had been found near the rocky cove, where Latimer's body had been discovered, his limbs tangled in seaweed, his face frozen in a contorted grimace, as if even in death he had fought against the fate that had befallen him. The villagers spoke in hushed tones of an accident, a tragic misstep on the perilous cliffs, but Eleanor had seen enough in her lifetime to recognize when nature had been given a helping hand. Latimer had not simply fallen, he had been placed there, positioned in such a way that the sea might wash away the evidence. But the sea, for all its ceaseless motion, had a habit of revealing secrets rather than keeping them. She leaned back in her chair, her sharp gaze flickering over the notes she had scrawled in her neat, methodical script. Latimer had been a man of ambition, and ambition, as Eleanor well knew, bred enemies. His plans to redevelop the harbor had been met with resistance from many, and not without reason. There was Captain Hugh Lansing, a former naval officer, and a staunch advocate for preserving the old lighthouse, one of the last relics of Ashford-on-Sea's maritime history. Latimer had lobbied for its demolition, claiming it was an eyesore, a relic of the past that stood in the way of progress. Lansing had fought him bitterly, using every bit of influence he had to delay the project. Was it possible that in the end he had taken matters into his own hands? Then there was Evelyn Harrow, the widow whose property Latimer had tried to seize under the guise of revitalization. The two had a history, one marred by legal battles and veiled threats. Eleanor had seen the way Evelyn's hands had trembled when she spoke of Latimer, the way her voice wavered when she insisted she had nothing more to say about him. Grief did not cause such tremors, but fear did. Had she finally rid herself of the man who had loomed over her for so long? And then there was Edward Vaughan, the reclusive investor who had been working closely with Latimer. It was no secret that their partnership had soured in recent months. Latimer had made promises he could not keep, deals that had unraveled, investments that had turned sour. Vaughan had much to gain from his untimely demise, not just financially but in terms of salvaging his own reputation. A drowning in accident was a clean way to sever ties. But was Vaughan the type to dirty his hands, or had he found someone else willing to do it for him? Eleanor's fingers tapped against the polished wood of her desk as she considered each suspect, turning their words, their expressions, their alibis over in her mind like puzzle pieces. None of them fit quite right, yet, but she knew that the truth was always in the details, in the contradictions, in the subtle shifts in behavior when a person was pressed just a little too hard. She stood, draping a warm shawl over her shoulders before stepping out into the crisp evening air. The village square was quiet, the only sound the occasional rustling of leaves in the gardens behind the vicarage. Tonight, the truth would start to unravel. She had arranged for a gathering, a polite tea, a social engagement on the surface, but beneath it, a careful orchestration of tension. Captain Lansing, Evelyn Harrow, Edward Vaughan, they would all be there, as would Inspector Giles, who had already begun to entertain his own doubts about Latimer's so-called accident. One by one they would arrive, offering cordial smiles, engaging in meaningless pleasantries, all the while pretending that nothing had changed. But Eleanor knew better. The guilty always made a mistake, a slip of the tongue, a glance held too long, a nervous fidget. It was always the smallest detail that unraveled the largest lies. And when it happened, she would be ready. Beyond the cliffs, the tide continued its restless whisper, churning with secrets, but never holding on to them forever. The sun hung low over Blackwood Manor, casting long creeping shadows across the overgrown garden, its once pristine hedges now unruly, and clawing at the cracked stone pathways. The scent of damp earth lingered in the air as Eleanor Kane took her seat beneath the gnarled oak tree, the perfect vantage point for what was about to unfold. Tonight was not just a gathering, it was a snare, carefully woven with the illusion of civility, baited with nothing more than polite conversation and a pot of tea. The guests arrived in slow, calculated intervals, their faces carefully composed masks of nonchalance, but their eyes betrayed the unease buried beneath. First came Colonel Harrington, his usual air of authority dampened by a stiffness in his gait, his hands gripping his walking cane a little too tightly. Then Miss Vance, her silk gloves hiding fingers that trembled ever so slightly as she smoothed the fabric of her dress, her smile too bright, too rehearsed. Dr. Whitmore followed, his expression unreadable, his eyes shadowed by something deeper than mere exhaustion. And lastly, Vivian Holloway, the late Edgar Blackwood's devoted niece, or so she had claimed. She arrived last, her footfalls hesitant, her gaze darting between the others as though weighing her odds of escape. Eleanor poured the tea with practiced ease, her movements unhurried, deliberate, watching as each guest took their place at the round table beneath the flickering lanterns. "A lovely evening," she murmured, stirring her cup idly, her tone light, yet laced with something heavier. "Such a shame about Mr. Blackwood, a tragic accident, or so it seems." A silence stretched across the gathering, thick as the mist that clung to the manor grounds. Colonel Harrington cleared his throat, his fingers tightening around the handle of his cane. "Unfortunate indeed," he muttered. "Slipping on those treacherous cliffs, the sea has claimed many before him." And yet, Eleanor mused, lifting her gaze, Mr. Blackwood was never one to take evening strolls alone. Not in this weather. She let the words settle, watching the ripple of tension they sent through her guests. A calculated pause, then she reached into her pocket and produced a single item, a small monogrammed handkerchief, the initials embroidered with painstaking precision. "This was found at the edge of the cliffs," she continued smoothly, placing the cloth onto the table. "A curious thing, isn't it, considering it does not belong to Mr. Blackwood?" Vivian stiffened, her breath hitching. Miss Vance's hands clenched around her teacup. Dr. Whitmore's eyes flicked to the fabric, then away, as if resisting the pull of a memory he'd rather forget. Colonel Harrington, however, remained unnervingly still. "What are you suggesting, Miss Kane?" His voice was even, but Eleanor detected the smallest shift in his posture, an unconscious tightening of the jaw, the slight tick of his fingers against his cane. "Oh, nothing at all," she said airily, tilting her head. "Merely that the sea may not be the only force at play here. But you all knew that, didn't you?" The stillness deepened, the night itself holding its breath. One by one, their carefully crafted alibis would begin to fray, their lies unraveling beneath the weight of her quiet persistence, and before this night was over, Blackwood Manor would give up its ghosts. The air inside Ashford Manor was thick with the scent of aged wood, and something more elusive, secrets, long buried but never truly forgotten. Margaret Caldwell sat at the head of the parlor, her gloved fingers lightly tracing the rim of her porcelain teacup, her gaze unwavering as her guests filtered into the dimly lit room, each one carrying the weight of their own concealed truths. She had orchestrated this gathering, with careful precision, ensuring every suspect was present under the guise of civility, though they all knew, deep down, that this was no ordinary tea. First to arrive was Mr. Whittaker, his usually impeccable posture betrayed by a slight hunch, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his waistcoat, as if to steady his nerves. Then came Evelyn Harrow, her delicate smile strained, her fingers twitching at the hem of her lace cuffs, her eyes darting too quickly between the others. Henry Lockwood entered next, his expression unreadable, though the tension in his jaw was unmistakable. And finally, Beatrice Holloway, young, beautiful and inexplicably shaken, her usual air of quiet elegance, now marred by something darker. Margaret poured the tea, her movements unhurried, her expression neutral, but the undercurrent of her words carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. "A shame about Lord Ashford," she mused, watching her guests over the rim of her cup. His death was so unexpected, the room seemed to still at her words, the polite murmurs fading into a silence that stretched taut between them. "A tragic accident," Mr. Whittaker muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "An unfortunate fall from the library balcony." "Yes," Margaret said smoothly, setting down her cup with a delicate clink, "though an accident implies a lack of intent, doesn't it? A subtle shift in the air, a stiffness in Lockwood's shoulders, the briefest flicker of unease in Beatrice's wide eyes." "Intent," Margaret continued, her voice light yet edged with steel, "is a curious thing. It lingers, even when one tries to disguise it. Much like the handkerchief found at the scene, a fine silk embroidered with initials that do not belong to Lord Ashford." Her hand slipped into the folds of her dress, retrieving the small fabric square, its edges still damp from the morning dew where it had been discovered beneath the balcony. "How very odd." Evelyn Harrow's grip tightened around her saucer, her knuckles whitening. Mr. Whittaker cleared his throat, his fingers curling into a fist against the arm of his chair. Henry Lockwood, however, remained motionless. Beatrice, on the other hand, seemed on the verge of speaking, her lips parted, her breathing unsteady, until Margaret's gaze met hers, halting whatever confession had been threatening to slip past her lips. "What exactly are you suggesting, Mrs. Caldwell?" Lockwood finally spoke, his voice low, controlled. Margaret tilted her head ever so slightly, studying him. "Oh, nothing at all," she murmured. "Only that the library balcony is not quite as treacherous as one might think. A sturdy railing, a wide ledge, hardly the sort of place one simply stumbles over. Another charged silence, a battle of wills waged in the flickering candlelight. Then, almost imperceptibly, Lockwood exhaled, his fingers flexing at his sides. "It was an argument," he admitted, though his voice was devoid of remorse. "Ashford was a fool. He threatened to expose everything. His mouth snapped shut, as though he had already said too much. The parlor door swung open before another word could be spoken, and in stepped Inspector Graves, his expression grim, his gaze sweeping the room before settling on Lockwood. "Henry Lockwood, you are under arrest for the murder of Lord Ashford." The room erupted in gasps, a flurry of movement, but Margaret remained still, her quiet satisfaction hidden behind the gentle tilt of her teacup. The pieces had fallen into place, just as she had intended. The truth, no matter how deeply concealed, always found a way to the surface. And tonight, Ashford Manor had given up its ghosts. The village of Raven's Hollow basked in the golden hue of the late afternoon sun, its cobbled streets lined with blooming lilacs, and the quiet hum of a world moving forward. But behind lace-curtained windows and the polite nods of its residents, an unspoken tension lingered, a shadow stretching long over the town, much like the one cast by the crumbling facade of Blackwood Manor. At her modest oak table, Eleanor Whitmore sat in the dim solitude of her study, fingers lightly tracing the rim of her porcelain teacup, as she watched the world beyond her window remain oblivious to the darkness festering beneath its surface. She had spent decades untangling the hidden truths of others, watching how deception cloaked itself in civility, how secrets lurked behind locked doors and practiced smiles. And now, she knew, she was on the cusp of unraveling yet another mystery, one that had unsettled even her practiced mind. Across town, Edmund Carrington, the manor's current overseer, paced his dimly lit study, his breath uneven as he shuffled through a set of ledger pages with trembling hands. The recent death of Lord Blackwood had left a void, not just in the estate's lineage but in its accounts as well. Whispers of embezzlement clung to his name like damp mist, and though he feigned indifference, the walls seemed to close in on him, each number scrawled in ink a testament to his mounting desperation. The scandal had drawn in the curious, some seeking the truth, others merely entertained by the spectacle of a fallen aristocrat, and the mystery surrounding his untimely demise. And yet, Despite the town's collective intrigue, no one had dared speak of the woman last seen at Blackwood Manor, the night before Lord Blackwood's body was discovered. Marianne Holloway had vanished into the folds of the town's gossip, slipping away as swiftly as the rumors that followed her. Some claimed they had seen her retrieve something from the manor, a small, unassuming box. Some whispered it held deeds. Others speculated it contained letters incriminating enough to shake the very foundation of the Blackwood name. But no one could say for certain, and that, Eleanor knew, was the true danger of a mystery left unsolved. Even with the official inquest ruling the death an unfortunate accident, there remained too many unanswered questions. Why had Marianne chosen that exact moment to disappear? Why had Lord Blackwood been so determined to meet with Carrington the night before his death? And why had the old man, known for his rigid temperament and distrust of nearly everyone, suddenly drafted a revised will only hours before he perished? The answers were buried beneath layers of half-truths and convenient silences, each omission a carefully placed stone in the path to justice. Even as the town settled into the illusion of closure, Eleanor knew better. She had seen this before, the way guilt festered, how the burden of knowledge left traces on the guilty, no matter how well they thought they concealed it. And yet, some questions would never be answered. Was Lord Blackwood's death truly an act of desperation? Had someone else, someone unseen, nudged fate along? Or was the real culprit still waiting in the shadows, content in the knowledge that sometimes, the best crimes were the ones that never had to be solved? As dusk descended upon Raven's Hollow, Eleanor sipped her tea, her gaze lingering on the dimming horizon, knowing that though the case had been closed, the truth had yet to fully surface. And perhaps in time, it never would. The garden outside Eleanor Whitmore's cottage was nothing remarkable. Wild lavender growing untamed near the old stone pathway, ivy creeping along the fence. But to her it had always been a place of quiet reflection. The world beyond carried on as it always did, indifferent to the secrets buried beneath its surface. People whispered behind curtained windows, pretending the past didn't haunt them, but Eleanor knew better. She stirred her tea slowly, her eyes distant, her thoughts threading through the case that had unsettled the very foundation of Raven's Hollow. "It's always the little things," she murmured, more to herself than to the company she kept. Across from her, Margaret Holloway, the vicar's wife, glanced up from her embroidery, curiosity flickering in her gaze. "Little things," she echoed, tilting her head. Eleanor smiled faintly, her fingers tightening around the delicate porcelain, footprints in the wrong place, a watch set to the wrong time, a book missing from a shelf. The things that seem insignificant at first glance but speak volumes when you know how to listen. She leaned back, letting the words settle in the heavy silence of the afternoon. "The sea," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "is full of hidden currents. You think you know which way the tide flows, but one unseen ripple can shift everything." Margaret hesitated, watching her carefully. "You're speaking of Lord Blackwood's death, aren't you?" Eleanor's smile did not waver, but there was a sharpness in her gaze now. "It wasn't an accident, that much I am certain of, but the truth is far more insidious than anyone cares to admit." The vicar's wife shuddered, setting aside her embroidery as a chill crept into the room, despite the warmth of the sun outside. "Then who?" Eleanor took a slow sip of tea before answering, her tone grave. "It didn't begin as murder. It began with something much smaller, a secret, a betrayal, a debt unpaid. The trial had come and gone, and with it, the village had reclaimed its illusion of peace. Edmund Carrington had been convicted, his desperate confession sealing his fate before the jury even deliberated. The verdict had been expected, a necessary resolution to a story that had rattled the town's fragile sense of security. But Eleanor knew better. Justice had been served, but the truth had been buried with Lord Blackwood. The missing box Marianne Holloway had taken from the estate remained a mystery. Some said it contained letters that could destroy reputations, Others swore it was nothing more than meaningless trinkets, and yet the weight of it lingered, like a question left unanswered. The missing signet ring, the one Lord Blackwood never removed, had never been found. A trivial detail, some believed, but Eleanor had seen how the smallest threads could unravel the entire fabric of a lie. Even now, as the village returned to its routines, as the whispers faded into the quiet hum of daily life, she knew better than to believe in neat endings. The past never truly rested, and secrets, no matter how deeply buried, always had a way of clawing back to the surface. For now Raven's Hollow would breathe easy, its people content in their ignorance. But Eleanor Whitmore had spent a lifetime chasing the things others ignored, and she knew one immutable truth: there was always another mystery waiting in the shadows, always another secret waiting to be unearthed. And she would be watching,